I wanted first to thank Don for taking the initiative to organize this event. No one needs to be told about anything about this moment where essentially, the way I would see it, it's up to us. I mean, you'd have to have been having your head in the ground not to understand, and I'll be talking about this in a second, not to understand the way in which the neoliberal political economy that has been put into place for the last 30 or so years was essentially incarnated in Hillary Clinton. And that is what you need to know in trying to, the first thing you need to know in trying to understand why this, this Donald Trump character is where he is. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is, as Don suggested, to try to provide an idea about the economic constraints on politics, so that we can, have an idea of what's in the ballpark, what's out, what's really not on, and hopefully that will inform our discussion of what might be happening in the Trump presidency and in relationship to alternative politics. Now, you would have had to have been vacationing, I think, on Mars, not to have gotten word of the incredible shift in income distribution that has been taking place over the last, again, since around 1980, thanks to Piketty and says we now understand that to look at income distribution is to, in this period, is to look at top earners. And what we have, as you probably all know, is a extraordinary shift upward in the percentage of income controlled by the top earners, and we're now pretty much at the peak that it's ever been in U.S. history. I don't know, people could quibble maybe right before, around 1929, it might have been a little bit higher, but it's about at the absolute peak. So everyone knows about that. But I think the discussions about income distribution have, in a way, obscured what, in my view, is the deeper development. And that deeper development is the just horrifically bad, it's really hard to say, to come to terms with how horrifically bad the economic, the development of the economy has been over the last 30, 40 years. So what you have, it seems to me, is the bottom line is to understand that decline. Decline is at the center of the, so to speak, paradigm. And it's in the context of that decline that we can really understand the development of the extreme development in terms of income distribution. So to put it, flatly right at the start, you have, even as early as the 80s, a very difficult time in getting any sort of significant growth, and therefore problems not only for working people, but even for capitalists. And it's at that moment that we have a political response, a political economic response to slowed growth, and this is the neoliberal development, which is all about shifting income upward, redistributing income upward. So you have these two trends, and that essentially, that's what I want to develop today. I want to talk about the economic, what's at the root of the declining dynamism of the economy, and then talk about the way in which relatively early on, it seemed like only yesterday, but it's a long time ago, that this trend, this upward redistributive trend occurred. And I think that upward redistributive trend is what has given, obviously, the opening to the world's far right in many forms, from Le Pen France to Brexit to what we have here. And I think understanding what happened in the economy gives us a very direct way in to what is happening in the polity. Okay, so let's begin. First and most important, we have been experiencing since around the late 60s, early 70s, declining economic dynamism across the world. Meaning, and it's quite shocking, meaning that if you're talking about GDP, or if you're talking about investment, capital stock, if you're talking about productivity, if you're talking about wages, if you're talking about per capita income, consumption expenditures, you name it, there is a more or less straight downward trend. So, and these are all the kind of, these are the standard variables that economists use to check out the health of the economy. And what we have across, not just in the US, but across the advanced capitalist countries, certainly, and we could talk about the developing world, but certainly in the advanced capitalist countries, we have that downward trend. Each decade, each business cycle, worse than the one before. So that's the bottom line, and I think that's where we have to start out, because you can't, when you're talking about income distribution, you have to ask the question, what is there to distribute? And what I want to imply is that there's not a lot, which is why we have such an organized, hardline, neoliberal politics, which shows, well, we can see right away, there's no sign that it's going to be, anything is going to change on that score. We already know who's been reelected as head of majority leader. I mean, Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. It's not exactly a kind of mea culpa about what's been going on. So why then? What has opened the way to this long downturn, as I would call it? I would say that the key here, and this is a kind of a familiar way of proceeding among Marxists, people on the left, is to look at the rate of profit. And what we had is a long post-war boom, quarter century, golden age, whatever you want to call it. Profitability was high. As we shift into a slower growth path, roughly between 65 and 75, the rate of profit, it's in that period, sharply falls. And it doesn't fall that much further. It falls a bit further by the end of the 70s, but it's basically stays down, maybe 40% below that peak. We're talking about manufacturing here. It's not as extreme outside, but it's a very, very, very sharp fall. So then, of course, if you're going to say that the key to a slowdown is the fall and failure to recover the rate of profit, then you have to ask the question, okay, $64,000 question is why fall in the rate of profit? This is an ongoing intense debate among everyone. Here's the way I would look at it. Here's what I see as the core of the problem, and I think if you see this, you can begin to see why neoliberalism, that is redistributive patterns, redistributive upward, becomes such a crucial alternative for the elites, for the ruling class, and so on. And so what I would say is the source of the problem is a fall in the rate of profit in manufacturing. So a fall in profitability. Why fall in profitability? Because there's a fall in profitability in manufacturing sector. So what's behind that? It seems to me what the pattern, and we don't have a lot of time for this, but the pattern of post-war growth, even starting as far back as the 50s and 60s, and it comes out of actually the structure that emerges in the late 40s, is that you have one after another later developing economy entering into the world market on the basis of its ability to reduce costs and to enter into the manufacturing sector where, to do the same thing as was being done before, but cheaper. So you have, first case was Germany actually, then Japan, then the NICs, then East Asian, then Southeast Asian economies, and then of course the big one, China, which really kind of just pushes everything over the brink. And then even now you have further entrants. So you have this ongoing entry into the economy, forcing down prices and making it difficult to sustain the rate of profit. Meanwhile, those already in the lines are not readily going to easily cede their positions, so they stay in the line. So what you have is, speaking very simply, and in a kind of rushed way, is that you have essentially a steady buildup of overcapacity instead of what you might expect, a fall in profitability, inducing those firms in those industries where that is to leave the line because profitability is low. What you have instead, you have a continual entry and not very much exit. So I see that as the core, and it's really the core of the problem for the advanced capitalist countries. Now, that said, you have between maybe the mid-60s and the end of the 70s fallen rate of profit of something like 40%. And this is not alleviated. The downward pressure is continuing. So the question is, what is the result of this? Why are we looking at profitability at all? The reason we are is because the fall in the rate of profit through a series of channels is what's responsible for that low growth, that very slow growth that I was talking about in the first place. So what's going on is that you have, with a fall in the rate of profit, you have a lower incentive, you have lower surpluses to invest. You have a lower surpluses to invest. So that means that there's lower demand for capital stock, capital goods, capital to, expand, right? So fall in the rate of profit in the first instance means fall in the demand for capital goods. Second, it induces the capitalists to take action against their workers, basically. And so what you have is a across-the-board attack on wages and, indirectly, with the help of the state, social spending. So what you have then is a fall in demand, a fall in consumer demand. And since the governments are quite attuned to the needs of capital, you have, thirdly, a drop-off in social spending and so on, which we all know about. Does become the heart, although not the only heart, of that neoliberalism development. So you have more or less continuing and permanent austerity. So what does that mean? You have problem of demand in capital goods, problem of demand in consumer goods, problem of demand in government services, and so this is going to force the economy downward. And in the past, that had always been followed by deep recession or maybe depression. But we know that didn't happen. And that's one of the essential features of the of the post-war period, distinguishing it from what came before. What you get is, of course, government stepping in to try to subsidize demand to make up for the demand that is lacking because of the fall in the rate of profit. So what is actually driving the economy downward, what is the direct driver of the weakening of the economy, is this problem of declining aggregate demand. So bottom line, fall in the rate of profit. But the way it works is through falling demand and falling growth of demand, and you'd expect that to be problematic, leading to some kind of deep downturn. But you don't have that. You have, starting pretty much right away in the 70s and 80s and so forth, you have the government taking responsibility for stoking demand. We know the story of deficit spending and low interest rates. That is adopted pretty much across the capitalist world, and is what it keeps the economy turning over. But because of the weakness of the economy, because that very growth, that very subsidy to demand keeps a lot of firms that should be going out of business in business, it means that over time, as you stoke the economy, as you stick in more and more demand, you get less bang for the buck, as the economists used to say. So this process of the growth of debt is essentially as the key to preventing the kind of cataclysm that was more or less to be expected in an earlier period. But the result is that with growth of demand, leading subsidized demand, bringing less growth, what you're ending up doing in effect is gaining stability at the expense of dynamism. And so by the early 90s, capitalists are looking around and the governments are looking around and saying, this really can't go on. But that is a key, that in my mind, to my mind, is a key moment, key turning point in the post-war development, because what they see at this moment, and what I want you to see at this moment, is the bind that they're in. So on the one hand, what they had always used, Keynesian remedies, is not working. But I don't know, probably a few of you remember what happened around the turn of the 90s in both Europe and the US, and that was that an impatience, an attempt to free up the market, right? And what that meant is they're going to stop this deficit spending. They're going to let the economy be free to grow on its own, with its own dynamism. But what did they find out? That as they did, both in the U.S. and in Clinton's, in the U.S. and in Europe, in the run-up to the Maastricht Agreement, what goes on is that they, remove that demand. The removal of the demand sends the economy into deep fall. So this is what I want to have you guys see, that already at this point, the bind that they're in is palpable. The reason I say that is because over the next period, which is, I don't know how many people were sort of born when, but for a lot of people who were, coming of age in the late 90s, early 2000s, there's this incredible illusion, which is of an economy that is no longer exactly collapsing, exactly falling. In other words, there's a kind of it's not saved, but it's kind of moderated. And what's going on there? That's the government turning to what you might call asset price Keynesianism or bubblenomics, which just means that interest rates are brought down to substitute for Keynesianism and drive the economy by driving up asset prices. And so first you had a stock market boom, then you had a housing boom. But these prices that are being driven up have no support from the actual income that's there. So in the 90s, you have a crazy stock market profits don't keep up, crash. You have in the 2000s, crazy housing bubble, supposedly supported by workers, the wages don't grow, and so there's a crash. And we have the Great Recession. So the Great Recession, what I want to emphasize about the Great Recession, which has been our lives for 9 years now, what I want to emphasize about the Great Recession is that represents a continuity, a taking up of the already existing path of growth. And if you guys had the time and just, it's the simplest thing to do, look at the numbers since 2009 in any indicator you want. And they're by far the worst, certainly since the Great Depression, and they're worse in a certain way because while the Depression was deeper, it only lasted maybe 8, 10 years, pretty miserable. That we've had a downturn going on for now like 30 years. So that's the starting point, the basis of the problem, and it's the problem. The weakness of the problem is the underlying weakness that Trump and company now have to face. That's the underlying weakness, and we can talk about how difficult to get a policy based on capitalist profit making is under these circumstances. Because what we watched is what happens when profitability is a determinant. We get this downward trend which reaches a rock bottom in this period now. Nothing's changed. Okay, so where does neoliberalism fit in here? Neoliberalism, what we all understand as this attack on working people, is the response to this terrible slowdown, because you're not getting a growing pie. Your pie is growing very little, and even if you get the same, you get a decent rate of profit, that's not going to add up to very much. And the difficulty here was already evident in the 70s and in the beginning of the 80s when they did this huge stimulus. In the U.S., and then they tried to protect American industry and subsidize American industry in the face of this intensified manufacturing competition. And what happened is you get no response, and you get a kind of intensification of that overcapacity that, in my view, that opened the way to the right, because what was clear was the Keynesians were completely at a loss. They had no way out. At the same time, the whole run of policymakers had no idea what can we do at this moment. So what happens at this moment, and that dominates the political economic situation, is what I would say is this what we're talking about in this neoliberal thrust is essentially has two aspects. One is the one that I think we come to first, because we're thinking of production and we're thinking of who gets gains from production. So we know massive attack on wages, marketizing everything, taking. David has written very eloquently about the many different forms in which what had essentially been parts of services, goods that had formerly been in the market, taken out of the market, put in the welfare state, education, you name it, massive state services, one by one, these are thrown back into the market, subject to competition. And when you have competition ruling, you have the people. You don't have to do much, because the people who have a lot of capital, people who have a lot of skills, people who have technological capacity, they just win out. That's what the market is about. So that is one side of it, and what has essentially happened to keep capitalists basically going is that you have a continual downward pressure on wages that is not really restoring profitability, not restoring dynamism, but keeping things going. But then there's the big story, which I think we know about, but we don't talk enough about. And that is the second article, I'd say, is the second element in neoliberalism. And what this is about is, it's a kind of brilliant, if you would think about it, because it started happening right around 1980 under Reagan. It started a little bit earlier than under Carter. And what it's about is saying, gosh, it's awful hard to make a profit out there. So what we're going to do is we're going to directly transfer income without all the, fuss and bother of, investing in new plant and equipment, investing in workers. We're going to just go straight to the, cut to the chase. And what are we going to do? Massive tax breaks. Corporations individuals. And so what you have there is this direct ripoff that this is only the first. You have the second, you might say, is the huge opening to investing in government debt that emerges from those giant deficits of Reagan. And even someone like George Will just was scandalized that, they're getting these incredibly high interest rates. They're just putting their money in there. This is the first experiment in driving the stock market up to provide income for rich people. And then there is the big one, which I don't have time to go into enough, but the big one is finance, the development of finance. And why development of finance? Because what you have to see is the way in which financial gain can take place has really been, in economic terms, has really been cut off. The economy is sliding down. What finance was actually it was a service. It was a service that gave corporations the ability to go on. So when you had this great boom, the banks boomed. When they went to Europe and multinational corporations, the banks followed them. High rates of profit for productive capital, high rates of profit for banks. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But at the point at which the economy is falling, there's no place. There's no place to be able to make a financial profit. And yet, it moved, so to speak. We know there is this gigantic growth of financial profits that already by 2000 had outrun manufacturing, and they got even higher. What's that about? I can't go into it, I'll just state it, is that, so I could come to the end of this talk right away, is that what this is about is effectively, on the one hand, government intervention to, at every point in the sort of financial cycle, deregulating or opening an area. We're talking now about investment, not in the real world, investment in financial assets. What's happened is there's a crisis of profitability for the banks because there was a problem of profitability in real production for the corporations. Yet, how can that be? How can they be able to get these gigantic profits? They do so in investing in financial assets, and they can make money investing in financial assets because they get political privileges. They are allowed to, there's no regulation of the new lines. People who are in there at the beginning, as the bubble happens, they do pretty well. When there's over-entry into the financial lines, they stimulate the financial assets to make a financial bubble. And then, of course, there is a crash, and what happens then? Of course, there's a bailout. So at every step, government's there. If I had time can show you exactly the same thing happens within the corporations, which by political means, so to speak, within the corporation, the leading level of financial managers is able by a political means, essentially, to operate in a situation where there's no way to make profits. They're able to make highly, highly risky investments for a little bit of time. Those investments pay off. They are the managers, so they take gains in fees, they take gains in wages, they take gains in bonuses. So that's what is going on with the rise of finance, a totally politicized development that needs to be understood in terms of the broader neoliberal upward redistribution. So now just very quickly to the politics. I think people can see, or should be able to see, the extraordinary absurdity of this. And we know that those people out there who voted for this guy who's no chance of giving them anything, they saw this absurdity. They saw a lot of what I've been talking about. So you have this kind of political some kind of hyper process pushing income in this direction by very highly political means. And it's this that is out there in front of everybody. And which, the only people who don't see it are neoliberal politicians, the financiers, the New York Times, all the people who talk to each other. And if you watch the Sanders campaign, all of this, or the Trump campaign, they can't possibly win. All these generals are for us, or all these bankers are for us. But everybody saw this as it is. So here's where it seems to me the Trump forces are, and the world, essentially the world right is at. The reason they have such a big opening is because of this neoliberal excrescence, literally excrescence. And so there is a dynamic political drive across the world to get rid of it, to attack it. And we've seen the various right-wing political manifestations of it. And this, it seems to me, is the kind of core logic of this, this whole Trump and the Brexit and Le Pen and all that. That's the core of it. That's logic of it, and it sort of gets them going. The only problem is now they're in office. And they don't just face that neoliberal redistribution issue. What they face is an issue of production. And that is where they, it seems to me, are going to be in deep trouble, because what's been going on for all this time is trying to find ways to profitably invest, and no one has found it. They had a great moment in Asia, subsidized by the United States. That's gone. Nowhere are people able to make a profit, and that's where they're really caught. Because what kind of incentive can work? And we just to kind of push the thing a little bit further. They have had the biggest Keynesian stimulus in the first part of the 21st century for about 7 years. They had Bush spending, they had housing bubble, they had a series of tremendous stimulus, and what did they get? Nothing. So I think that's the framework. The political viability, so to speak, of Trump, which is kind of scary, because if he can keep things going for 4 years, he has a way forward. But he is up against incredibly difficult circumstance in actually trying to revive the economy. In my opinion, that's all out. The only way that can happen is if the economy is brought out of the realm of running by virtue of trying to make a profit and being brought essentially into different rules, which would be a kind of a statist solution. There have been statist solutions, we remember. not just on the right. I mean, not just on the left, but on the right. And that may be something that we should be thinking about. But I'll stop there.
Thanks very much indeed.